Rain poured mercilessly from the dark sky, drenching the empty streets outside the hospital. A frail young woman stumbled forward, her hands clutching her swollen belly as waves of pain crashed over her. Her breath came in short, ragged gasps, mixing with the cold night air. She tried to step inside the hospital, but the moment she reached the entrance, a sharp contraction made her knees buckle. She collapsed onto the wet pavement, her fingers gripping the cold ground as she let out a weak, desperate cry. People rushed past, umbrellas shielding them from the rain, their hurried footsteps splashing through puddles. No one stopped. No one even looked at her. She tried to call out, her lips trembling, but her voice barely rose above a whisper. "Please, someone." Tears streamed down her face, though it was impossible to tell them apart from the rain. Another contraction hit her like a bolt of lightning. She screamed, her fingers digging into the pavement, her entire body trembling. Her soaked clothes clung to her shivering frame, her strength slipping away with each second. She turned her head towards the glowing hospital sign, so close yet impossibly far. A nurse glanced in her direction but quickly looked away, disappearing into the warmth of the hospital, leaving her alone in the storm. Her breath hitched as she felt the undeniable shift inside her. The babies were coming. Right here, right now. Her mind screamed for help, but her body had already surrendered to the merciless night. She tried to lift herself up, but her legs refused to move. Her fingers pressed against her belly, feeling the violent movement of the lives struggling to enter the world. A car sped past, splashing icy water onto her fragile body. She gasped, coughing, her lips turning pale as exhaustion threatened to pull her under. The contractions grew stronger, each one tearing through her with unbearable force. Her vision blurred, her fingers trembling as she realized she had no choice but to do this alone. With one final scream, her body gave in. The sound of newborn cries pierced through the raging storm. She gasped, her chest rising and falling rapidly as she looked down at the tiny, shivering life in her arms. A boy. His frail body quivered against her skin, his cries weak yet determined. Before she could catch her breath, another wave of agony struck her. She gritted her teeth, pain consuming her, but she refused to give up. Minutes later, another cry broke through the night. A girl. The mother sobbed uncontrollably, holding both of them close, her body shaking violently. She tried to wrap them in her soaked shawl, shielding them as best as she could. Their tiny faces were red, their bodies cold against her chest. She knew they wouldn't survive long like this. Rain poured over them, showing no mercy. Her arms tightened around her children as she rocked them gently, her lips pressing weak, trembling kisses against their foreheads. "Please, someone, save my babies," she whispered into the empty street, her voice barely audible. Her vision darkened, her body growing weaker with every passing second. She wanted to stay awake, to protect them, but exhaustion was dragging her under. With her last bit of strength, she let out one final cry for help before everything faded into silence. The mother, her clothes soaked through, stumbled onto the slick street, her arms trembling as she held her newborn twins tightly against her chest. She shivered uncontrollably, the cold seeping deep into her bones, but her babies, so tiny and fragile, seemed to be her only source of strength. She looked up, hoping for a kind soul to stop, but the street was empty, save for the sound of the relentless rain and the faint hum of passing cars. "Please, help me," she pleaded, her voice barely rising above the howling wind. Tears mixed with the raindrops on her face as she continued to walk, her body shaking with cold and exhaustion. Each step felt heavier than the last, but she couldn't stop. Not now, not with her children in her arms. She caught sight of a car approaching in the distance and instinctively raised her hand, hoping someone would notice. The headlights grew brighter as the car sped toward her. She felt a rush of hope, but it quickly faded as the vehicle splashed through a puddle, drenching her from head to toe. Her heart sank, her shoulders sagged in defeat. She wiped her eyes, but the rain kept coming, blurring her vision. The car didn't even slow down. "Please, please," she cried again, her voice raw with desperation, but the world seemed to ignore her. The street remained empty, the relentless rain only adding to her isolation. She looked around, her gaze desperate, but no one was there to help her. She had never felt so invisible, so small, and so hopeless. Her babies stirred in her arms, but the cold wind whipped around them, and she feared they too would be lost to the storm. She let out another sob, feeling the weight of the world pressing down on her. The rain kept falling, the city around her indifferent to her suffering. Her steps faltered as she tried to move forward, but every inch felt like an eternity. The sleek black car screeched to a halt on the rain-soaked street, its tires spinning for a moment before it came to a complete stop. The door swung open, and a well-dressed man stepped out, his tailored suit unbothered by the rain. He looked around, confusion flickering across his face. As his eyes scanned the darkened street, he froze when he saw her. The woman, standing alone in the downpour, holding two tiny babies against her chest. Her face was pale, her eyes filled with tears. His heart skipped a beat. There was a brief moment of disbelief before concern washed over him. His gaze locked onto the babies, their tiny, fragile forms trembling in her arms. He could see the pain in her eyes, the desperation. He rushed toward her without a second thought, his feet splashing through the puddles. His expression softened, his face now full of shock and sympathy. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice breaking through the storm. His mind raced, but all he could focus on was the woman standing before him, her pain so raw, so real. The millionaire reached her side, his heart pounding in his chest as he took in the sight of her trembling form. Without a second thought, he quickly removed his expensive coat, the dark fabric contrasting sharply against the stormy night. He wrapped it around her and her babies, pulling them close to shield them from the cold. His hands were gentle as he tucked the coat around them, trying to warm their fragile bodies. The woman's shivering intensified, and he could see the exhaustion in her eyes. The desperation, the pain, it was all too clear. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the pouring rain, "save my children." Her eyes locked onto his, tears streaming down her face, mixing with the rain. It was a plea so raw, so desperate that it sent a chill through him. The babies, too, seemed to cry in unison, their tiny, trembling forms nestled close to their mother's chest. The millionaire's hands shook as he knelt beside her. "I'm here," he whispered, though he had no idea how to help. He felt helpless, caught between his desire to save her and the overwhelming realization that he was unsure how. The woman's eyes fluttered, the weight of her exhaustion catching up with her. She clung to him weakly, her grip loosening as her strength finally gave way. She collapsed into his arms, her body limp and her breath shallow. His heart raced as he lifted her gently, holding her against him as though she were made of glass. "No, no, you can't," he whispered, panic rising in his chest. The babies, too small to understand, whimpered in her arms, their cries almost drowned out by the storm. He turned, desperately looking for someone, anyone to help. But the streets were still empty. The rain continued to fall, the storm showing no mercy. The moment, a fragile intersection of hope and despair, was unfolding in his arms. The millionaire, his heart pounding, carefully lifted the fragile woman into his arms, her limp body clinging to him. The rain poured down in sheets, but there was no time to waste. With a determined look on his face, he rushed toward the hospital, his steps frantic, each second feeling like a lifetime. As he burst through the hospital doors, he yelled for help. Nurses rushed forward, their faces a blur as they quickly assessed the situation. "She's severely weak," one of the doctors said, her voice urgent. "We need to stabilize her, immediately." The millionaire's hands trembled as they transferred the woman to a gurney. His eyes never left her, fear and worry etched across his face. He barely noticed the frantic movement around him. But his attention quickly shifted to the babies. They were struggling to breathe, their tiny chests rising and falling erratically. A nurse gently placed one of the babies in an incubator, but the struggle was still evident. The tension in the room grew thick as doctors worked quickly, their every movement precise, yet filled with urgency. The millionaire stood frozen, his gaze locked on the woman and her babies, hoping against hope that they would survive this race against time. As the minutes dragged on, the millionaire stood outside the hospital, pacing restlessly. His mind couldn't escape the haunting memories that had resurfaced the moment he saw the woman and her babies. He leaned against the cold, damp wall, his gaze distant as he drifted into the painful past he'd tried so hard to bury. Years ago, he had been a different man, one with a family, a wife he loved deeply, and a child on the way. Their laughter filled their home, and for the first time in his life, he had felt complete. But everything shattered in an instant. A car accident. His wife, his unborn child, they were gone. The pain of losing them had crushed him, a grief so deep that it threatened to swallow him whole. The tears he had fought so hard to hold back all those years now threatened to spill. He closed his eyes tightly, the memory too vivid to escape. The sound of his wife's laughter, her warm embrace, and the soft touch of his unborn child's tiny hands, gone in the blink of an eye. The mother's face, the one he had just seen filled with pain and desperation, reminded him so much of his own loss. The helplessness, the fear for the life of her children, brought back memories he had tried to forget. He felt the weight of his grief all over again. The pain that had never truly gone away twisted in his chest. He realized how much he longed to undo what had happened, to have the chance to hold his wife, to see his child grow. The thought was too much to bear. He took a deep breath, pushing the memories down as best as he could. But his hands, shaking slightly, betrayed him. The woman, the babies, they had reminded him of a past he couldn't change. All he could do now was hope he could save them, just as he had once hoped for his own family. The hours that followed were a blur of frantic medical attention, but at last the doctor stepped out, her face a mixture of exhaustion and relief. "They're stable," she said, her voice filled with quiet triumph. "The mother and babies will be all right." A wave of relief washed over the millionaire, his body sagging with the weight of the worry that had consumed him all night. He stepped into the room where the mother had been carefully tended to, his eyes never leaving the tiny twins resting in her arms. The room was still, save for the soft beeping of the machines monitoring their vitals. He had stayed by their side, never once leaving, as if his presence could somehow protect them from the storm. When the mother finally stirred, her eyelids fluttering open, she looked around in confusion. Her gaze fell on him, sitting beside her bed, his eyes filled with concern. And then she noticed the twins, one cradled gently in his arms while the other rested in a nearby crib. Her voice, soft and hoarse, broke the silence. "Why did you help me?" she whispered, tears pooling in her eyes. "Why did you risk everything for me and my babies?" He looked at her with a gentle smile, the kind that spoke of understanding, of someone who had lived through pain and come out the other side. "Because no one should suffer alone," he said simply, his voice filled with sincerity. Her eyes welled up with gratitude, her heart swelling with emotion. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," he replied, reaching out to squeeze her hand. "Just know that you and your babies are safe now. That's all that matters." The room fell into a peaceful silence as she closed her eyes, the weight of the past hours finally lifting. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to rest, knowing that she wasn't alone anymore. As the days passed, the millionaire returned to check on the mother and her babies, offering not just his help but a promise of a new life. One afternoon he sat beside her, his eyes warm with kindness. "I want to offer you more than just help," he said softly. "I want to give you a chance to rebuild, a home, financial support, a fresh start." Tears immediately sprang to the mother's eyes as she looked at him, overwhelmed by the generosity of a man she barely knew. I don't know how to thank you," she whispered, her voice shaking. "There's no need to thank me," he replied, his tone sincere. "You and your children deserve more than survival. You deserve to live without fear." The weight of his words broke her, and she collapsed into sobs. Her heart full of gratitude, she looked at her newborn twins, then back at him, her voice steady but full of emotion. "I promise, I will raise them well. I'll make sure they grow up happy, loved, and safe." The millionaire nodded, a smile tugging at his lips, knowing he had just helped turn a page in their lives. A new chapter that would be filled with hope, not struggle. A few years later, the millionaire found himself at the doorstep of the small house where the mother and her now-grown twins lived. The sound of laughter reached him before he even stepped inside. The children, now full of energy and life, ran toward him with wide grins, their eyes shining with excitement. "Uncle!" they shouted in unison, their voices full of affection and joy. The millionaire's heart swelled as he crouched down to greet them, his face lighting up with a smile. He hugged each of them tightly, feeling the warmth of their love, knowing that this moment was a testament to the new life they had all built together. Inside, the mother stood with a proud smile on her face. She had transformed over the years, from the fragile woman he had met in the rain to a strong, independent woman who now worked hard to provide for her children's future. Her confidence radiated, and she greeted him with gratitude, though her eyes reflected a quiet strength. "I couldn't have done this without you," she said softly, her voice filled with emotion. "But now, we're making our own way." The millionaire looked at the family he had helped to rebuild, his heart full of peace. They had come so far, and the future was bright for them all. The millionaire stood in the doorway, watching the mother and her now thriving twins, his heart swelling with emotion. He couldn't help but smile as the children laughed, playing together in the yard, their joy infectious. This moment was everything he had hoped for when he made the decision to help them. The mother, now standing beside him, placed a hand on his shoulder, her eyes filled with gratitude. "You saved us. You gave us a second chance at life," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I can't ever thank you enough for everything you've done for us." As the rain began to fall once more, just like that fateful night when their journey had begun, the millionaire looked up at the sky, his thoughts lost in the memory of it all. The droplets fell softly around them, but this time they felt like a blessing rather than a burden. "Maybe this was destiny," he murmured, a sense of peace settling over him. For the first time in years, he truly felt like he had found a family again. As he turned to leave, the mother and her twins waved goodbye, their faces full of joy. He nodded at them one last time, knowing that their future was secure, their lives forever changed. If you've enjoyed this emotional journey and want to see more heartwarming stories like this, make sure to subscribe to A Vast Realm of Learning and share this video with your friends. You never know what incredible story might be waiting for you next.